I think we should have a round of applause for John for reading so brilliantly, don't you? That was great. And soldiering with the microphone cutting out. Sorry about that. I think my Bible got packed, didn't it? But it'd be great if you could keep Nehemiah 1 open this morning. Because I want to talk for a few moments about rebuilding. And I don't know whether you're feeling sort of optimistic or pessimistic generally at the moment about things sort of in general. I don't know whether you're on social media or you read the newspapers. If you are, then they'll tell you we are in trouble. We're in economic trouble. There's cost of living trouble. Nobody can afford anything. We're in geopolitical trouble. There's wars and rumours of wars. We've got leadership trouble. We've got a new prime minister every 5 minutes. We're in environmental trouble, we're in mental health trouble, we're in relational and emotional trouble, we're in family breakdown trouble, community trouble, race relations trouble. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of normally a pretty naturally glass half full kind of character. But I reckon probably this morning, if I was to ask, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but probably most of us to a greater or lesser extent would recognize this morning that there is quite a lot of trouble. But most of all, there's spiritual trouble. Our nation, our town is far from God. Only 5%, something like that, of British adults go to church. 19 out of 20 on any given Sunday. This morning, 19 out of 20 are, shopping, watching their kids play rugby, gardening, lazing around at home, far from God. And so we're in trouble, but reassuringly, it's not the first time. 'Twas ever thus. This is not the first time that people have been in trouble. The book of Nehemiah, which we are beginning a series of Sunday mornings studying this morning, the book of Nehemiah really begins on a pretty somber note. Have a look down at verse 2. Nehemiah asks for a status update for the people. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. I questioned them. I wanted to know, says Nehemiah, about the Jewish remnant, the people who lived in Jerusalem, those who had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem itself, the city. And they said to me, verse 3, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. That's a bad diagnosis, isn't it? The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. So the people were in trouble, but history also shows us that although people have been in trouble before, people are able to get out of trouble again. It doesn't have to stay that way. And the story of Nehemiah, which we're going to be looking at over these weeks, is a great story because it's the story of rebuilding. It's the story of rebuilding. And that's what Nehemiah, this key verse for the book, chapter 2, verse 5, where John finished up. What does he want? I answered the king, if it pleases the king and your servants found favor in his sight, he says, let him send me to the city in Judah, because he was in Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire, verse 1 of chapter 1 told us. Let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. That's what Nehemiah is all about, rebuilding. So we're starting a new series this morning. We're working through the book of Nehemiah. Why? Why study this sort of little-known book in the Old Testament? Well, for one thing, it's just a great book. It's a really interesting and exciting read, as John read it so beautifully for us. And not only that, people are always saying to me, can't we have a little bit more Old Testament? People sort of feel like the Old Testament is a little bit inaccessible, or they don't really know our way around the Old Testament. Can we have a bit more up in the Old Testament, because it's unfamiliar or confusing? Well, if that's you, we are right up at the dusty end of the Old Testament this morning. And it's worth knowing that the Old Testament, which is all the stuff in the Bible before Jesus. New Testament is everything after Jesus. Old Testament is everything before Jesus. But the books of the Old Testament, because it's not one book, it's many books, 39 books of the Old Testament. I think, someone nod if you know. No one knows. 39 books, I'll say confidently. 39 books in the Old Testament, they're not in chronological order. So they're grouped together by category. And Nehemiah comes at the end of the category of the history books, describing what happened. It comes just before what you call the wisdom literature, which is all the Psalms and the Proverbs and that kind of thing. And also before the prophets, loads of books of prophets. So it's at the end, right at the end of the history chronologically of the Old Testament, even though it's not at the end of our Old Testament. Does that make sense? So if you think of the history of the Old Testament starting all the way at the beginning of the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, and then working all the way through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and getting up into Egypt, and then the Exodus from Egypt out of slavery and Moses and the 10 plagues, and then the wandering in the wilderness, and then eventually they get into the Promised Land. The land flowing with milk and honey, and then there's the season of the kings, and David and Solomon and the monarchy, and you've got all of that history, which is kind of goes up and down with the people doing better and then worse and then better and then worse. But all the time, what the prophets are saying is, if you go far from me, there's going to be judgment. Okay, you're going to be thrown out of the land, and that's eventually what happens at the end of the Old Testament. Concludes with the people being in exile. So in 587 BC, think like 2,500 years ago, 500 odd years before Christ, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem, and they took the Israelites off to exile in Babylon, which is where Nehemiah is based, writing from. But the Old Testament concludes with the return from exile, coming back to the city of God. And the return from exile happens in 3 stages. So the first stage is, there's a guy called Zerubbabel, who, there's a joke in there about him being a squash player. I think it's something about serving in the courts of Zerubbabel, but we won't make that joke. So Zerubbabel brought 50,000, something like that, people all the way back from exile to rebuild the temple. And so they restored and renewed the spiritual life of the city. Then after that, Ezra, he came and restored the Word of God, the Torah, and gave cultural restoration renewal to the people. And the third and the final stage of the return from exile, right at the end of the Old Testament, chronologically, in 444 BC, was Nehemiah. And Nehemiah brought a group back to repair. The temple was repaired, the Bible was in place, but the city didn't work. The walls were broken down, and that was the diagnosis at the start of this book, is that they needed to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Rebuilding the walls. Now, I don't know what you were up to in half term. We had all that nice weather. We were very fortunate. We were in our inaugural trip in our recently acquired caravan down in Cornwall. So we spent, I'm sorry if you endured the storms back here, but we escaped them and we were down on the beach for the week, having a great time. And so I don't know when the last time was that you went to the beach and built a sandcastle, but I have to say that I had forgotten how enjoyable it is to while away an afternoon building a sandcastle. And so my brother-in-law and I, Matt, who lots of us will know, we spent really quite a long time, actually, most of an afternoon, undertaking fairly serious construction works. And we got right into it. We discovered that we had to upgrade our kit. Frankly, our plastic spades weren't quite cutting the mustard, so we traipsed up to the little kiosk to invest in a proper metal shovels. And as we built up the perimeter defences around our citadel, we kind of entered into the spirit of Nehemiah. We experienced some of the frustration at the walls being broken down. We experienced a measure of opposition, not from surrounding hostile warring tribes, but from our own children, who didn't seem to be taking it quite as seriously, frankly, as we thought they ought to, especially Barney, who took a perverse delight in ruining our hard work. But eventually we were finished, and or at least we were told by our wives that it really was time for us to stop. And we didn't quite sing songs of thanksgiving, but we easily could have done. And frankly, that in a nutshell is the story of Nehemiah. It's about rebuilding the walls. Chapter 1, verse 3, have a look. the wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. And the rest of the whole of this book, have a glance over. Let me give you a sneak preview of what's to come. End of chapter 2, Nehemiah inspects Jerusalem's walls. Chapter 2, verse 17. I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we won't be in disgrace. So in chapter 3, look what they're doing. It names, actually, all the builders of the wall. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work, rebuilt the sheep gate. That's a particular bit of it. They dedicated it, set its doors in place, and they built as far as the Tower of the 100 that they dedicated. Then the men of Jericho built the next bit. And then the Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. You read chapter 3, it's naming all of the different bits of the wall and all of the different people who had an involvement. Everybody gets to play. Everybody has a gift, something to contribute. And chapter 4 over the page, it wasn't easy. They had opposition to their rebuilding. But chapter 5, Nehemiah helps the poor. They ask, what kind of city do we really want to be once these walls are up? It needs to be a place which is fair and equitable and where we look after the vulnerable. That's the city of God. Lists all the people who returned to the wall, to the city, what they got up to afterwards. And the high point, chapter 12, flicking on to chapter 12, verse 27, is the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived, were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and cymbals and harps and lyres and musicians brought from all the villages around. It was a great scene. Look down to verse 43. On that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. So it's gripping stuff, isn't it? It's a page turner. I commend it to you. If you're after over these next few weeks, why don't you read Nehemiah? It's brilliant. If you're in a life group, why doesn't your life group spend these next few weeks studying this book? It's an exciting narrative. In fact, if you turn back to chapter 1, did you pick this up when John was reading it? Unusually, uniquely, the only book in the Old Testament which is a first-person narrative. He keeps saying, I did this, I did that. The word of the Lord came to me. I mean, how cool is the way that the first chapter finishes? You know, that last sentence is what a plot twist. He's the cupbearer to the king, a cliffhanger to finish chapter 1. You can almost hear the Netflix kind of ba-dum, end of the episode. And what a great pilot episode it is at the start of chapter 1. You find out, gosh, he's got this extraordinary privileged position. You know, the guy who tastes the wine for the king of the Persian Empire, which was a pretty dangerous job to do, because if somebody's going to poison the king, you're going to find out about it, and your next cup of wine might be your last. But it was an amazingly responsible position, because the king isn't going to just trust anybody to taste his wine for him. So he had the king's ear, and he was able to say to him, look, this is what's on my heart. So this book, somebody has said it's like a general's diary, a governor's report, a civil record, a management handbook, and a personal memoir. It's a great book. And it's a great book for us to study if, as I suspect probably a lot of us are, if we're concerned about the sorry state of the people. And we want to do as they did in Nehemiah's day and recommit themselves to the task of rebuilding the city of God. So, with a few minutes left, what are we going to take away from the pilot episode? What are we going to take away from chapter 1? Well, if we're going to rebuild, and I hope we kind of feel inspired over these weeks, that we want to all play our part to the task of building God's kingdom. Well, Nehemiah, at the introduction, gives us a little bit of an insight. We feel we get to know Nehemiah the man. And it gives us an insight into what kind of people we're going to need for the rebuilding. We're going to need people like Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a model for us. We're going to need, here in Melksham in 2026, people who will say with Nehemiah, let me rebuild the city. So what kind of people are they? 4 standout qualities, 4 characteristics, 4 things for us to look to that Nehemiah exemplifies that we can look to and pray that we would be able to follow in his footsteps. Nehemiah loved the people. Nehemiah trusted God. Nehemiah knew where he was going. And Nehemiah was willing to give his life. First, if we're going to rebuild, and I hope we are, Nehemiah loved the people. Chapter 1, look down at verse 4. When I heard these things, this terrible report of the dire state of the people, when I heard these things, says Nehemiah, verse 4, I sat down. He had to sit down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. It affected him, didn't it? We've already said that the people in our day are in great trouble and disgrace. Somebody, you know that storm, quite a few people have been saying, feels like it's almost a bit of a parable, a bit prophetic, that storm. Doesn't it feel? We've been battered a little bit. It feels a bit like that. And how does that affect us? Does it move us? What's the state of our hearts? In some ways, isn't it easier to kind of, at the beginning when I said there's all this trouble, in some ways it's easier to, just to pretend like everything's okay. Because if we do that, we pretend everything's okay, well then we don't have to do anything about it. Or maybe it's easier just to sort of get cynical and slightly hard-hearted and sort of go, well, actually it's always bad. And so then we shrug it off. And therefore also, well, that means we don't have to do anything either as well. Or it's easier, in some ways, just to throw up our hands in despair and say, well, we can't do anything about it. But Nehemiah did none of those things. First of all, Nehemiah, he felt it. It affected him. His love for the people was so strong that he had to sit down. He wept. He mourned. He fasted. Are we fasting? He prayed. What are we doing? When we look around and we see, Jesus saw the people harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and he had compassion. Have we got compassion? Do we feel the state of the people? Do we weep at the trouble, the spiritual trouble that people are in? Does it move us? If we're going to rebuild, you've got to love the people. Secondly, we need to trust God. And the amazing thing about Nehemiah, despite the trouble that people were in, he had rock solid confidence that the Father is able. He's able to intervene. He's able to make it happen, verse 5. This is his great prayer. So after he'd mourned, then he prayed, he lifted his heart to heaven. Lord, the God of heaven. Which God? The great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Even though we break the covenant all the time and we don't keep the commandments, he's faithful. He's not going anywhere. He casts himself on the promise and the mercy of God. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying. Verse 8, if you know the promises when they went into the land, Moses gave them these great promises saying that you're going to go off in all sorts of directions and God is going to judge you. But if you'll return to me, I will welcome you. And verse 8, Nehemiah recalls that promise. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I'll scatter you among the nations. Well, that's what had happened. By this point, they'd all been judged. They were all in Babylon. They were all in exile. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, you can never be too far from God. If you're far from God this morning, even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling place for my name. Nehemiah knew that. He was so confident. He totally trusted that God is able. Do we believe that if we get on our knees and we return to him and we repent, that God is able to restore us, to restore our church, to restore our nation, no matter how far we are from him? It's happened in history before. It can happen again. Third thing, you need to trust God. We need to know where we're going. We need to know where we're going. One of the scary things about our current moment is that our secular leaders don't know where they're going. I don't want to be political. I don't know whether you voted for the current government or not. Doesn't matter. But most people who agreed haven't got a clue. Nobody knows the plan. But look at the plan, the vision that Nehemiah has as he approaches the king. Chapter 2, verse 5. I answered the king. I prayed to the God of heaven. By the way, sorry, I just love that arrow prayer at the end of verse 4. I prayed to the God of heaven. We don't know what the prayer was. Help, probably. And I answered the king. If it pleases the king, and your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah so I can rebuild. Well, the king goes, how long is it going to take? When are you going to get back? So he's thinking, phew, it pleased the king to send me. So I set a time. Well, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, who's he? Keeper of the royal park. So he's going to give me the wood to make the beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall, for the residence I'm going to occupy. And because the gracious hand of God was on me, he granted my requests. Nehemiah knows exactly where he needs to go, who he needs to speak to, how long it's going to take, how he's going to get back, what materials he's going to need. I'm going to need wood from this guy, and I'm going to need a letter that's going to get me past that. But he's got a vision, he's got a plan. What's the next chapter of our church's life and ministry going to look like? We need a plan. We need God's vision. Fourthly, we need to love the people. We need to trust God. We need a vision. We need to be willing to give our life. When Nehemiah woke up that morning and he decided that he was going to let Artaxerxes, the king, the ruler of the Persian Empire, most powerful man in the world, he was going to let him see his tears. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he reckoned if he was going to ask him to go and rebuild, he knew that it might cost him his life. End of chapter 2, verse 1. I had not been sad in his presence before. Well, right, because he could have easily just had him summarily executed for disloyalty to the Persian Empire. Don't let him see how you feel. But he couldn't help it. He let him see his tears. And the king says, why are you so sad? End of verse 2, I was very much afraid. But he did it anyway. Now, you may have heard of, have you ever seen Shackleton's famous advert in the paper? Shackleton, who went to the Antarctic, and he was looking for people to join him on this crazy expedition that he was undertaking. And apparently he put in the paper, I don't know whether it's actually true, but he put, the apocryphal story says Shackleton's advert in the paper went like this. It said, printed in the paper, men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return, doubtful. But honor and recognition in the event of success. And if we are going to put our hand to the task, if we're going to rebuild, if we're going to see the city of God established, it won't happen with people who are only half committed. We need people like Nehemiah who are willing to give their lives. Well, how does that make us feel? Are we up for it? How many of those 4 boxes do you tick? Where are we going to find someone like that? I don't know about you, but I hear this great description of the people who are needed to do God's work. And, frankly, none of us are up. On a good day, maybe 2 out of 4 you might tick downhill with a following wind. Nobody can do this. In fact, spoiler alert, we're going to spoil the story every week as we go chapter by chapter. I'm going to tell us the end every week, because the book of Nehemiah they don't all live happily ever after. Not even Nehemiah could do it. They rebuild the walls. They get there and it all goes wrong. And at the end of the book of Nehemiah, the very last thing of the Old Testament, what are we left? We're crying out for somebody who can be the true Nehemiah, the true rebuilder. We're longing for the Messiah, the one who comes along, who does love the people infinitely, who's got a passion for the people, who will weep. Shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept at the pain his friends were going through. He wept over the city of Jerusalem. We're longing for somebody who will trust God, who will shoot up another arrow prayer in the garden. Not my will, but yours be done. the one who knew exactly the plan, and the one who was willing to give his life to do it. We're longing for the true and better Nehemiah. And I'm going to finish by reading a glimpse of the heavenly city. We're in exile, says the New Testament. We're the ones who are in the same position as him, wanting to put our trust in the leader in order to be able to go and do God's work. But we need his vision. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to conclude by, would you stand? Let's stand. And I'm going to read the vision of where we're going, which is at the end of the Bible. You can read along with me, or you just let me listen to it, listen as I read it. But Revelation 21, there's a new city. We're not trying to actually build the kingdom here or now. In a way, we're kind of, everything that happens in the here and now is a foretaste of that which is really to come. As we build the ministry of the church, as we do all the great stuff which is happening in the parish, and we pray as we see the cultural life of our nation restored, we pray for a foretaste of what is to come. But ultimately, the great hope is the heavenly city, with our true and better Nehemiah, the one who calls us to live in his city. So this is what what Revelation says, the glimpse of the vision of where we are going. Here are the parallels. The great city, come, Revelation chapter 21, when the angel said, I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high. And he showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And it shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, as clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, with 12 angels at the gates. And on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the west, and the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And the angel who talked with me had a measuring tool of gold to measure the city, its gates, and its walls. The city was of gold. The city was laid out like a square as long as it was wide. He measured the city with the rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length. And its wall was made of jasper, and the city of pure gold, as pure as glass. And the foundation of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper. And the gates were 12 pearls, and the streets of the city were of gold, as pure as transparent glass. I didn't see a temple in the city, because the Lord was its temple. That didn't need a sun or the moon, because the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there, and the glory and the honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life.